What would you do if your husband's mistress invited you to lunch just to flash a custom diamond necklace in your face, bragging that her wealthy sugar daddy bought it for her? For Charlotte, the answer was simple smile, sip her Earl Grey tea, and make a single phone call. Because what the mistress didn't know was that the very Mayfair penthouse she was living in, the diamonds on her neck, and the bank funding it all, belonged entirely to Charlotte's royal father. Charlotte Hayes lived a quiet, meticulously ordinary life in the heart of Chelsea, London. To the outside world, and more importantly to her husband, she was simply an art historian working at a boutique gallery. She wore understated cashmere, took the tube when it rained, and spent her weekends tending to the hydrangeas in her modest townhouse garden. David, her husband of 5 years, loved her for her simplicity. He often boasted to his colleagues in the ruthless world of investment banking that his wife was his grounding force, a woman untainted by the toxic greed of the London elite. What David did not know, what no one in his circles knew, was that Charlotte Hayes was actually Princess Charlotte of the House of Holstein, the youngest daughter of King Leopold, a reigning European monarch whose sovereign wealth fund held assets worth billions across the globe. Charlotte had fled the suffocating protocol and relentless paparazzi of her royal lineage in her early 20s. She craved a life where she was valued for her mind, not her title. When she met David at a charity gala, she was wearing a simple name tag and managing the catering staff, while he was an ambitious, handsome junior analyst at Goldman Sachs. She fell entirely in love. David saw a beautiful, hard-working girl, and Charlotte saw a man who wanted her for exactly who she was. When they married in a quiet civil ceremony at Chelsea Old Town Hall, King Leopold had been apoplectic with rage. He had threatened to cut her off entirely, but a father's love eventually outweighed his royal pride. Secretly behind a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore trusts, King Leopold had ensured his daughter's comfort. When David suddenly received a miraculous promotion and a massive injection of capital to start his own wealth management firm, Lawson and Company, he believed his sheer brilliance had won over a consortium of anonymous Swiss investors. In reality, King Leopold had simply bought the board. For years their marriage was a sanctuary. But as David's firm grew, so did his ego. The man who once brought Charlotte wilted daisies from the corner shop now wore bespoke Savile Row suits and spent his evenings at private members' clubs like Annabelle's and the Ned. He became obsessed with status, surrounding himself with the flashiest players in Mayfair. Charlotte watched the shift with a quiet, growing sorrow. She accommodated his late nights, his sudden business trips to Dubai and Monaco, and the creeping distance between them. The first undeniable fracture appeared on a rainy Tuesday in November. David had come home at 3 a.m, smelling faintly of scotch and a heavy, unmistakable perfume, Baccarat Rouge 540. It was a scent that commanded attention, entirely unlike Charlotte's subtle floral fragrances. When she casually mentioned it the next morning as she poured his coffee, David didn't even look up from his iPad. "Client meeting," he had muttered smoothly. An eccentric tech heiress. She practically bathed in the stuff. Charlotte let it go, but her intuition, sharpened by years of navigating the manipulative courts of European royalty, was instantly on high alert. 2 weeks later, she found the receipt. It was crumpled in the pocket of his Burberry trench coat, a purchase from Cartier on New Bond Street for a Panthère de Cartier watch, retailing at £25,000. Charlotte had not received a watch. Her birthday had come and gone the previous month, marked only by a hasty dinner and a generic bouquet of roses arranged by David's assistant. She did not scream. She did not throw his clothes onto the street. The blood of monarchs ran in her veins. She had been trained since childhood to maintain absolute composure in the face of betrayal. Instead, Charlotte opened her laptop and began a quiet, meticulous investigation. She hired a private investigator, a former MI6 operative who specialized in discretion for high-net-worth individuals. Within 48 hours, she had a name, a face, and a highly curated Instagram feed. Her name was Chloe Sinclair. She was 24, a high-fashion influencer and social climber who lived her life out loud on the internet. Chloe's grid was a mosaic of private jets, designer bags, and cryptic captions about her mystery billionaire. There, in a post dated just 3 days ago, was Chloe's wrist draped over the steering wheel of a Range Rover, wearing the exact Panthère de Cartier watch. The caption read, "When he says, I'm the only investment that matters." Charlotte stared at the screen, a cold knot forming in her chest. David, the man whose entire empire was secretly funded by the very royal family he thought Charlotte had no connection to, was openly playing the part of a billionaire sugar daddy. He was using King Leopold's money to fund a parallel life with a woman who represented everything Charlotte had run away from. The ultimate betrayal wasn't just the affair. It was the sheer arrogant delusion of it all. David believed he was the king of his universe, untouchable and supreme. He had no idea that the ground beneath his custom-made Italian leather shoes was owned entirely by his quiet, unassuming wife. And soon, Charlotte decided he would find out exactly what happens when you cross royalty. The confrontation did not happen by Charlotte's design, but by Chloe's sheer audacity. By December, David's recklessness had peaked. He was barely coming home, citing a massive merger that required him to stay at a hotel near Canary Wharf. Charlotte played the supportive wife, flawlessly packing his bags and kissing his cheek, while her private investigator forwarded her daily photographs of David and Chloe, walking arm in arm into a luxurious residential building in Grosvenor Square. Then came the direct message. Charlotte was sitting in her small office at the gallery when her phone buzzed. It was an Instagram notification from an unknown account, but the profile picture was unmistakable. Chloe Sinclair. "We need to talk, the Connaught, tomorrow at 1 p.m. Unless you're too scared to hear the truth about your husband." Charlotte stared at the message. A slow, chilling smile touched her lips. She didn't reply immediately. She let Chloe wait for 6 hours before sending a single word, "Agreed." The next afternoon, the dining room at the Connaught was humming with the hushed chatter of London's elite. Charlotte arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in her usual understated uniform, a navy wool turtleneck tailored trousers, and her simple gold wedding band. She ordered an Earl Grey tea and waited with the serene posture of a queen holding court. Chloe Sinclair arrived 15 minutes late, ensuring all eyes were on her. She was a striking woman, tall and aggressively glamorous, wrapped in a white Max Mara coat with a Celine handbag hooked over her arm. As she slid into the booth opposite Charlotte, the heavy scent of Baccarat Rouge 540 settled over the table like a toxic cloud. Chloe looked Charlotte up and down, her perfectly glossed lips curving into a smirk of profound pity. She took in Charlotte's plain sweater and lack of visible diamonds, visibly calculating her victory. "I honestly didn't think you'd show—" Chloe began waving a hand to decline the waiter's offer of a menu. "But I suppose David has kept you in the dark for so long, you must be desperate for some clarity. I'm perfectly clear on the situation, Miss Sinclair." Charlotte said, her voice soft-cultured and entirely devoid of emotion. "But by all means enlighten me as to why you requested this meeting." Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on the pristine white tablecloth. The Cartier watch caught the light of the chandelier. "David is leaving you. He hasn't had the heart to tell you because he pities you. He told me all about your little life in Chelsea, how you're just a simple gallery worker. You don't fit into his world anymore, Charlotte. He's a titan in the financial district. He needs a woman who looks the part, who belongs in high society." Charlotte took a slow sip of her tea. "And you believe you are that woman?" "I know I am." Chloe laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Look around you. This is my world. David and I are building a life together. In fact, he just bought us a place. Our place." Chloe reached into her Celine bag and pulled out a heavy set of keys, tossing them onto the table. Attached to the keys was a distinctive solid brass fob engraved with a subtle crest, a lion rampant holding a crown. Charlotte's eyes locked onto the crest. The air in her lungs stilled. The penthouse at the Wellington in Grosvenor Square. Chloe bragged, her eyes gleaming with malice. 5 bedrooms, private elevator, panoramic views of the city. He paid $20 million for it in cash. He's moving his things in this weekend. I'm telling you this so you can pack your bags and leave the Chelsea house quietly. Keep your dignity." Charlotte stared at the brass fob. The Wellington. She knew the building intimately. She knew it because the property was not for sale. It had never been for sale. The Wellington was the crown jewel of the Harrington estate portfolio, a private real estate trust owned entirely by King Leopold, her father. David hadn't bought the penthouse. He couldn't have. He had leveraged his firm's assets, the very firm funded by the royal family, to sign a lease agreement likely funneling millions in consulting fees to secure the property under a corporate name. He was using the King of Holstein's money to rent the King of Holstein's property, all to house his mistress. The sheer monumental stupidity of her husband was almost breathtaking. 20 million? Charlotte murmured, her voice laced with a dangerous silkiness that Chloe completely failed to recognize. That is quite an investment. He spares no expense for the woman he truly loves, Chloe sneered, reaching up to adjust a heavy diamond tennis necklace around her throat. He bought me this for our 6-month anniversary. Do you know how much a custom piece from Graff costs, Charlotte? No, of course you don't. Charlotte looked at the diamonds. She thought of her father sitting in his palace reading the quarterly reports of Crown Estate holdings. She thought of David signing fraudulent checks convinced of his own invincibility. You're right, Chloe, Charlotte said, placing her teacup delicately onto the saucer. I have lived a very sheltered life, but I am a fast learner. Good, Chloe said, snatching the keys back and dropping them into her bag. Then I expect you'll sign the divorce papers without making a fuss. David's lawyers are sharks. If you try to fight him for his money, he will bury you. You'll walk away with nothing. Charlotte smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant smile that finally made Chloe falter just for a fraction of a second. I assure you, Charlotte said, standing up and smoothing her trousers, I do not want a single penny of David's money. Enjoy the penthouse, Chloe. The views truly are spectacular. Charlotte turned and walked out of the connaught, leaving the mistress staring after her in confusion. As she stepped into the cool London air, Charlotte pulled out her phone. She didn't call a lawyer. She dialed a private encrypted international number. Your Highness, a deep voice answered on the second ring. Get my father. Charlotte commanded her disguise of the mild-mannered wife, melting away, replaced by the iron will of a royal heir. It is time to audit Lawson and Company, and I want the eviction notices drawn up for the Grosvenor property by morning. The call from London reached the Winter Palace in Holstein, just as King Leopold was finishing his evening review of state affairs. When his private secretary handed him the secure line, whispering that it was the princess, the monarch's stern face immediately softened. He had waited 5 years for his headstrong, brilliant daughter to call him with something other than polite holiday greetings and reassurances that she was perfectly fine living a peasant's life in Chelsea. But when Charlotte spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable freezing authority of her royal bloodline. She did not cry. She did not ask for comfort. She delivered a precise surgical briefing on David Lawson's infidelity, his gross misuse of the royal family's shadow investments, and his brazen acquisition of the Grosvenor Square penthouse under a corporate front. He has forgotten his place. Father, Charlotte concluded, looking out the window of her black cab as it rolled through the rain-slicked streets of London. He believes he built his empire with his own hands. I want him to watch it turn to dust. King Leopold remained silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, terrifying rumble that had made prime ministers tremble. You are my daughter Charlotte. The blood of kings is in your veins. I warned you about the arrogance of common men who mistake borrowed power for their own, but you have handled this with honor. Now it is my turn. Within the hour, the formidable machinery of the Holstein Sovereign Wealth Fund was silently activated. King Leopold summoned Alistair Montgomery, the ruthless Oxford-educated director of Vanguard Heritage Trust, the innocuous-sounding front company that held David's entire firm in its grasp. Alistair was given a single devastating directive: dismantle Lawson and Company from the inside out, legally, financially, and publicly. The next morning, David Lawson arrived at his Mayfair office feeling like the undisputed master of the universe. He was wearing a new charcoal Tom Ford suit and sipping a matcha latte. his mind preoccupied with the logistics of moving his custom golf clubs into the new penthouse with Chloe. His firm was reportedly managing over £3 billion in assets. His gorgeous young mistress was wrapped around his finger, and his quiet, oblivious wife was safely tucked away in Chelsea, completely ignorant of his dual life. He strutted into the glass-walled boardroom, expecting his morning briefing. Instead, he found his chief financial officer, a usually stoic man named Richard Pale, and sweating profusely behind his desk. Surrounding Richard were four strangers in severe, identical dark suits. They were not smiling. "Richard, who are these gentlemen?" David demanded, his voice echoing with practiced annoyance. "I have a 10 o'clock call with Dubai, and I don't have time for unscheduled audits. Mr. Lawson." The tallest of the strangers said, stepping forward. He produced a leather folder and laid it precisely in the center of the mahogany table. "I am Mr. Montgomery. We represent Vanguard Heritage Trust, the primary and majority stakeholders of this firm." David's irritation flickered into a brief dismissive smile. Vanguard was the silent Swiss-based consortium that had bankrolled his entire operation. They were faceless, hands-off investors who had never once interfered in his day-to-day operations. "Ah, Vanguard. A pleasure. Though I usually deal with your associates in Geneva. To what do I owe the pleasure of this physical visit? As you can see by our quarterly reports, our returns are exceeding all projections." "Your reports are works of fiction, Mr. Lawson," Alistair Montgomery said softly. He didn't blink. "Our forensic accounting division has spent the last 12 hours reviewing your offshore transfers. We have identified 22 unauthorized withdrawals disguised as consulting fees and acquisitions. Most notably, an ongoing funnel of capital directed toward a luxury lease at the Wellington in Grosvenor Square, as well as several high-value jewelry purchases at Graff and Cartier." David's heart stopped. A cold, nauseating dread clawed at his throat. He stared at Alistair, trying to maintain his composure. "Those are legitimate client entertainment and corporate housing expenses. In this tier of wealth management, optics are everything. We must entertain our high-net-worth individuals appropriately. You are entertaining a 24-year-old Instagram influencer, Mr. Lawson." Alistair corrected his tone, dripping with aristocratic disdain. "You have utilized primary investor capital to fund a fraudulent personal lifestyle. This constitutes gross embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate fraud. Now listen here." David barked, attempting to summon his usual domineering authority. "I built this firm. Vanguard wouldn't have a footprint in London without my connections. You can't just barge in here and make these wild accusations based on a few luxury purchases." Alistair opened the leather folder. "As of 8 a.m. this morning, Vanguard Heritage Trust has officially frozen all operational accounts associated with Lawson and Company. Furthermore, under the morality and embezzlement clauses of your founding contract, which you clearly did not read thoroughly, we are stripping you of your title as CEO effective immediately. Your personal assets, which are tied to the firm's equity, are currently under injunction." David stumbled backward, his knees suddenly weak. He collapsed into one of the ergonomic leather chairs, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "Frozen. You can't freeze the accounts. I have margins to cover. I have payroll. I have a £20 million lease that requires a quarterly deposit by Friday SOSRs. You have nothing, Mr. Lawson," Alistair said coldly, gathering his documents. "You will remain in this building while our team seizes your servers. Do not attempt to leave and do not attempt to contact your brokers. If you try to move a single penny, we will involve Scotland Yard before lunch." As the auditors descended upon the office like a swarm of locusts dismantling his empire hard drive by hard drive, David sat paralyzed. He pulled out his phone beneath the desk, his hands shaking violently. He had to fix this. He had to move money from his personal offshore accounts before Vanguard found them. But when he logged into his private banking portal, the screen flashed a bright, blinding red error message. "Account suspended. Contact administrator." In a matter of minutes, the Titan of Mayfair had been reduced to a beggar in a Tom Ford suit, and he still had absolutely no idea that the architect of his destruction was currently at home in Chelsea, calmly watering her hydrangeas. While David was experiencing the terrifying, systematic dismantling of his financial world, Chloe Sinclair was experiencing a very different kind of crisis in Knightsbridge. Ignorant to the impending doom, Chloe was fully immersed in the delusion of her newly cemented status. She was sitting in the VIP lounge of Harrods, surrounded by silk pillows and attentive sales associates. Today was the day she was finalizing her wardrobe for the grand housewarming party she had planned for the penthouse at the Wellington. It was to be the social event of the season, a glittering debut that would firmly establish her not just as an influencer, but as a bona fide member of London's elite circle. She had spent the morning trying on vintage couture and sipping complimentary champagne. She had finally settled on a breathtaking emerald green Valentino gown that perfectly highlighted her custom graph diamond necklace. Beside her sat Simon, a highly sought-after celebrity event planner whose services cost more than most people made in a decade. So the floral arrangements will be entirely white orchids flown in from Holland to contrast with the dark mahogany of the penthouse foyer. Simon explained, tapping on his iPad. We have the Michelin-starred catering team confirmed, and the string quartet will be playing modern pop covers. The total for the initial deposit is £85,000, Miss Sinclair. I'll need that cleared today to secure the ice sculpture and the beluga caviar. Of course, Simon. Throw it all on the black card, Chloe said with a breezy, arrogant wave of her hand. She pulled David's American Express Centurion card from her Celine bag and handed it to the Harrods concierge, who had respectfully approached to ring up the Valentino gown and a pair of Jimmy Choo heels. Chloe leaned back, taking another sip of champagne. She thought of Charlotte's plain, unadorned face at the Connaught the day before. The memory made her laugh out loud. The poor, pathetic wife actually thought dignity mattered more than power. Chloe was living proof that ruthlessness was the only currency that counted. She had won. She had the billionaire, she had the penthouse, and she had the lifestyle. A few minutes later, the concierge returned. His polite, deferential smile had vanished, replaced by a tight, uncomfortable grimace. He placed the heavy metal black card on the glass table. I am terribly sorry, Miss Sinclair, the concierge murmured, keeping his voice low to avoid drawing the attention of the other wealthy patrons in the lounge. It appears the card has been declined. Chloe paused her champagne flute halfway to her lips. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Excuse me, that's an Amex Black card. It doesn't have a limit. Try it again. You must have entered the chip incorrectly. I have tried it 3 times, madam. The concierge said, his tone cooling significantly. The terminal indicates that the account has been frozen by the issuer. I cannot release the merchandise. Simon, the event planner, suddenly stopped tapping on his iPad. He looked over his wire-rimmed glasses, his professional demeanor slipping into sudden wariness. Planners to the ultra-rich possessed a 6th sense for financial trouble, and a declined Centurion card was the equivalent of a siren blaring. That's impossible. Chloe snapped her cheeks, flushing with a sudden ugly heat. She snatched the card from the table. David is reorganizing his portfolio. He's doing a massive merger this week. His private banker probably locked it for a security check. Simon, give me your terminal. Simon hesitated, then handed over a sleek, portable payment device. Chloe aggressively tapped the card against the screen for the £85,000 party deposit. Declined. Call issuer. The words flashed in bright, unforgiving red. The silence in the VIP lounge was deafening. The sales associates who, just moments ago, had been practically bowing to her, now exchanged knowing, pitying glances. In the brutal hierarchy of Knightsbridge shopping, a declined card was a social death sentence. Miss Sinclair, Simon said, slowly sliding his iPad into his leather briefcase. Perhaps we should pause the event planning until your benefactor sorts out his administrative issues. I require all deposits in full before my team lifts a single orchid. It's a mistake, Chloe hissed, her voice trembling with rage and sudden creeping panic. She grabbed her phone and dialed David's private number. It went straight to voicemail. She dialed again. Voicemail. Keep the dress on hold, Chloe ordered the concierge, grabbing her coat. I will be back this afternoon. Someone at the bank is getting fired for this. She stormed out of Harrods, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hailed a cab and ordered the driver to take her straight to Lawson and Company in Mayfair. She was going to burst into David's office and demand he fix this humiliation immediately. Meanwhile, miles away in Chelsea, Charlotte was methodically packing a single elegant leather trunk. She did not pack clothes or shoes. She packed her grandmother's tiara, her royal passports, and a collection of rare first edition books that David had never bothered to look at. She knew the exact timeline of the destruction. Her father's team provided her with hourly updates. She knew David was currently trapped in a boardroom watching his legacy be ripped apart piece by piece. She knew Chloe's cards were bouncing across London. When the front door of the Chelsea house opened at 6 o'clock that evening, Charlotte was sitting in the living room calmly reading a novel. David walked in looking like a man who had survived a shipwreck only to realize he was stranded on a desert island. His tie was undone, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were wide with a frantic hollow terror. He had spent the entire day trying to stop the bleeding. Vanguard had been merciless. Not only were his accounts frozen, but the news of his firm's restructuring had already leaked to the Financial Times. His phone had not stopped ringing with furious clients demanding their money he no longer had access to. "David," Charlotte said softly, marking her page and setting the book down. "You're home early. How was the merger?" David looked at his wife. His sweet, simple, naive wife. For a split second, a wave of profound guilt washed over him. He had ruined everything, but the instinct for self-preservation, the same arrogance that had led him to this disaster, quickly took over. He couldn't tell her the truth. If he told her he was broke, she would panic. He just needed time to secure a loan to fight Vanguard in court to fix it. "It's fine." David lied, his voice cracking. He walked over to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a massive glass of scotch, his hands trembling so badly the bottle clinked against the crystal. "Just a minor compliance issue. The auditors are being overly aggressive. Nothing I can't handle." Charlotte watched him drink. "Compliance issues." She repeated, her tone perfectly mild. "That sounds stressful. I hope it doesn't affect our finances. I was hoping to renovate the garden this spring." No, everything is fine." David choked out, avoiding her gaze. "Just don't spend any large amounts on the joint cards for a few days, just to be safe." Charlotte smiled, a small, secret smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, darling, I wouldn't dream of it." She knew he was lying to her face, desperately clinging to the illusion of control. And tomorrow, when the eviction notices were served at the penthouse, that final illusion would shatter completely. The next morning, London awoke to a blanket of crisp, unforgiving frost, mirroring the sudden chill that had descended upon David Lawson's life. However, Chloe Sinclair remained fiercely determined to ignore the cracks forming in her gilded reality. Waking up in her boutique hotel suite, temporarily booked until the penthouse was fully furnished, she convinced herself that the Harrods incident was nothing more than a clerical error. David was a titan. Titans did not simply run out of money overnight. Dressed in a pristine cream Chanel boucle suite, Chloe hailed a black cab and directed it to Grosvenor Square. Today was the day her interior decorator was supposed to finalize the installation of her custom velvet sofas at the Wellington. She intended to spend the afternoon lounging by the floor-to-ceiling windows, taking selfies with the London skyline to reassure her followers that her fabulous life was perfectly on track. She marched through the heavy gold-plated revolving doors of the Wellington with the aggressive confidence of a woman who believed she owned the building. The grand marble lobby, usually a place where the staff bowed their heads in quiet reverence to the ultra-wealthy residents, felt unusually still. Chloe breezed past the reception desk, not bothering to make eye contact with the concierge, and headed straight for the private elevators. She pressed the gold button for the penthouse. Nothing happened. The digital display remained blank. Frowning, she pressed it again, harder. "Miss Sinclair!" A crisp, authoritative voice echoed across the marble floor. Chloe turned to see the head concierge standing behind the desk, his expression devoid of the sycophantic warmth she had come to expect. Beside him stood a tall, severely dressed man in a charcoal pinstripe suit holding a leather-bound folio. "The private elevator has been deactivated, Miss Sinclair." The concierge said, his tone perfectly polite but entirely unyielding. Chloe bristled, her manicured hands curling into fists. What are you talking about? Turn it back on immediately. My decorators are supposed to be arriving in 10 minutes, and I have zero patience for building maintenance issues today. The man in the pinstripe suit stepped forward. He did not look like building maintenance. He looked like the kind of man who liquidated corporations for sport. There will be no decorators today, Miss Sinclair, nor will you be accessing the penthouse. I am Mr. Carmichael, head of legal affairs for the Harrington estate. I don't care who you are. Chloe snapped, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that drew the attention of a wealthy, elderly couple passing through the lobby. My boyfriend David Lawson paid £20 million for a long-term lease on that property. I have the keys right here. She dug furiously into her Celine bag, retrieving the brass fob with the lion and crown crest, slamming it onto the polished marble desk. Mr. Carmichael looked at the keys with supreme indifference. That lease is null and void, effective as of midnight last night. Mr. Lawson utilized fraudulent corporate funds to secure the deposit. The primary stakeholder of Lawson and Company Vanguard Heritage Trust has formally seized all assets and frozen Mr. Lawson's accounts. The funds wired to the Harrington estate have been flagged as embezzled capital and returned to the trust. Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. The words fraudulent, embezzled, and seized echoed in her ears like gunshots. That is a lie. She stammered, the Chanel suit suddenly feeling entirely too tight. David is a billionaire. David Lawson is a soon-to-be indicted criminal, Miss Sinclair. Mr. Carmichael corrected, smoothly sliding a thick legal document across the desk. This is a formal notice of eviction and a trespass warning. The personal items you had already moved into the property, which amounted to 3 boxes of designer shoes and several cases of champagne, have been placed in the service alleyway. You have exactly 15 minutes to collect them before building security disposes of them. You can't do this! Chloe screamed, her carefully curated influencer persona shattering completely. I am a resident. I will sue this building. I will ruin you on social media. You will do no such thing, Mr. Carmichael replied, his voice dropping to a dangerously low register. The Harrington estate is privately owned by a sovereign entity that values its privacy. If you utter a single word about this property in public, our legal team will tie you up in defamation litigation until you are bankrupt. Now I suggest you collect your shoes from the alley. Humiliated, shaking, with a mixture of absolute fury and creeping terror, Chloe stumbled backward. She turned and practically ran out of the lobby, nearly colliding with the glass doors. Once on the freezing pavement, she pulled out her phone. She bypassed her usual text messages and called David directly, her finger jamming the screen. He answered on the 4th ring. Chloe, I can't talk right now. They locked me out, Chloe shrieked, standing on the sidewalk in Mayfair as Londoners hurried past her. The Harrington estate lawyers just kicked me out of the Wellington. They said you embezzled the money? David, what the hell is going on? My cards are declining. Our apartment is gone, and my party is ruined. There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. When David finally spoke, the arrogant swagger of the Mayfair Titan was entirely gone. He sounded like a terrified, broken child. It's all gone, Chloe, David whispered, his voice cracking. Vanguard locked me out of the firm. They found the offshore transfers. They took the company, the accounts, everything. I'm sitting in a Costa Coffee because I can't even pay for a taxi. Chloe stopped breathing. The reality of the situation crashed over her like an icy wave. There was no billionaire. There was no penthouse. She had hitched her wagon to a man who had stolen money to impress her, and now the real owners wanted it back. Where are you? Chloe demanded, her voice instantly dropping its hysterical pitch, replacing it with a cold, calculating sharpness. Costa on Piccadilly, David muttered pathetically. Chloe, you have to stand by me. We can get through this. I have a lawyer looking into the Vanguard contracts. If I can just get access to my personal trust— Stay there, Chloe interrupted, hanging up the phone. 10 minutes later, she walked into the crowded coffee shop. The scent of roasted beans and wet wool was a sharp contrast to the luxurious environments they usually frequented. She found David sitting in the corner staring blankly at a cold Americano. He looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. His Tom Ford suit was rumpled and his eyes were bloodshot. When he saw her, a pathetic glimmer of hope flashed across his face. He reached out to take her hand across the sticky laminate table. Chloe, thank God. Listen, I need you to float us for a few days, just until the injunction is lifted. Book us a suite at the Dorchester on your card. Chloe snatched her hand away as if he had burned her. She looked at him with profound disgust. My card. The cards you told me to max out. They're all frozen, David. Harrods practically threw me out yesterday. I'll pay you back, I swear it. David pleaded, his voice rising in desperation. You know I'm good for it. I built that firm. You didn't build anything, Chloe spat, leaning in close so the other patrons wouldn't hear. You were playing with someone else's money and you got caught. I don't do broke, David. I don't do coffee shops, and I certainly don't date criminals. David stared at her, stunned. Chloe, you said you loved me. You said we were building a life together. I left my wife for you. You haven't even told your wife yet, you coward. Chloe sneered, standing up. She adjusted her Chanel jacket, a cruel, mocking smile touching her lips. This is over. Don't ever contact me again. Wait, David hissed, reaching for her coat. You have the Graf necklace. It's worth 200,000 pounds. We can sell it. We can use the cash to hire a defense attorney and get a flat. Chloe laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cut through the cafe's ambient noise. She reached up and touched the heavy diamonds resting against her collarbone. We know David. You gave this to me as a gift. It's mine. Consider it payment for the time I wasted on a fraud. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving David utterly alone, financially ruined and abandoned. Outside, Chloe immediately hailed a cab to Hatton Garden London's historic jewelry quarter. She was panicked, but she was a survivor. She knew a private dealer who specialized in high-end discreet acquisitions. If she could offload the Graf necklace for even half its retail value, she would have 100,000 pounds in cash, enough to flee to Dubai and find a new actual billionaire before the scandal broke in the tabloids. She arrived at a heavily fortified storefront and was buzzed into a private viewing room in the back. Mr. Henderson, a jeweler with a loop perpetually hanging around his neck, greeted her with a polite nod. Miss Sinclair, Henderson murmured, offering her a leather chair. To what do I owe the pleasure? I need to liquidate a piece, Chloe said briskly, unclasping the diamond necklace and placing it on the black velvet mat on his desk. Custom Graf. Perfect clarity. I need a cash offer today. Henderson adjusted his glasses, picked up the necklace with gloved hands, and examined the intricate setting under a bright halogen lamp. He murmured appreciatively at the craftsmanship. Then he flipped the clasp and peered closely at the microscopic serial number engraved on the platinum lock. He moved to his computer terminal, typed in the sequence, and waited. A moment later, a bright red warning banner flashed across his screen. Henderson's professional demeanor vanished. He looked at Chloe, his eyes narrowing with deep suspicion. He did not hand the necklace back. Instead, he placed it securely inside a locked drawer in his desk. What are you doing? Chloe demanded, standing up. Give that back. I cannot do that, Miss Sinclair. Henderson said coldly, his hand hovering near a silent alarm button under his desk. This specific serial number has been flagged on the International High-Value Asset Registry this morning. It was reported as purchased with stolen corporate funds belonging to Vanguard Heritage Trust. It is currently classified as seized criminal evidence. It was a gift, Chloe shrieked, her perfect facade crumbling completely. He bought it for me. If you have a grievance, you may take it up with Scotland Yard. Henderson replied, his voice hard. They issued the seizure notice. In fact, standard protocol requires me to notify them that the stolen asset has been brought into my shop. Shall I call them now, or would you prefer to leave my premises immediately? Chloe stared at the locked drawer. The last remaining piece of her wealth, her final lifeline, was gone. She had nothing. No apartment, no rich boyfriend, no diamonds, and no money. She turned and fled the shop, stepping out into the freezing London rain, with absolutely nothing to her name but the clothes on her back. While Chloe's world collapsed in Hatton Garden, Charlotte sat in the opulent wood-paneled library of Vanguard Heritage Trust's London headquarters. Across the polished mahogany table sat Alistair Montgomery, sliding a pristine stack of legal documents toward her. "It is done, Your Highness," Alistair said respectfully, bowing his head slightly. "Lawson and Company has been entirely absorbed back into the Crown's portfolio. Mr. Lawson has zero equity, zero capital, and zero legal recourse. The Harrington estate has secured the penthouse, and the jewelry has been flagged for repossession." Charlotte picked up the solid gold pen resting beside the documents. She looked incredibly serene, the true daughter of a king. "And the divorce papers?" she asked quietly. "Drafted exactly to your specifications," Alistair confirmed. Due to the overwhelming evidence of his financial crimes and the ironclad prenup he foolishly signed under the guise of your modest family inheritance, he is entitled to absolutely nothing. He will leave this marriage with the exact amount of money he had when he met you. Charlotte signed her name with a flourish. "Perfect. Have them delivered to the Chelsea house this evening. I believe my husband will be coming home soon looking for a shoulder to cry on." The rain in London had turned into a relentless, freezing downpour by the time David Lawson finally abandoned his spot at the Costa Coffee on Piccadilly. His phone battery had died 3 hours ago, leaving him entirely cut off from the escalating nightmare of his professional ruin. He had spent the afternoon wandering aimlessly through Green Park, his expensive Italian leather shoes soaking through his mind, frantically trying to piece together a survival strategy. Every avenue he considered ended in a brick wall. His private bank accounts were frozen under suspicion of fraud. His so-called friends in the financial district, men who gladly drank his 1,000-pound bottles of champagne at Annabelle's, had suddenly become unreachable the moment the Financial Times published the breaking news of Vanguard's hostile seizure. And Chloe, the woman he had risked his entire marriage for, had discarded him in a public cafe the second the credit card stopped working. There was only one place left to go, the quiet ivy-covered townhouse in Chelsea. As David walked the final few blocks to his home, he began to construct a narrative in his head. Charlotte was his safety net. She was sweet, unassuming, and entirely disconnected from the cutthroat world of Mayfair finance. She spent her days appraising obscure oil paintings and reading historical biographies. She wouldn't understand the complex legalities of corporate restructuring or offshore asset freezes. All he needed to do was frame Vanguard as a cartel of unethical corporate raiders who had launched an illegal hostile takeover of his firm. He would play the victim. He would tell her they needed to tighten their belts for a few months while his lawyers sorted it out. Charlotte Loyal and Simple Charlotte would believe him. She would make him tea, tell him everything would be all right, and they would weather the storm. He pushed open the heavy front door, shivering as the damp chill clung to his bones. The house was usually filled with the scent of dinner roasting in the oven or classical music playing softly from the living room. Tonight, it was completely silent. "Charlotte," David called out, his voice hoarse. He shrugged off his soaking wet overcoat, dropping it carelessly onto the hardwood floor of the foyer. He walked into the living room and stopped dead in his tracks. Charlotte was sitting in a high-backed velvet armchair by the unlit fireplace. She was not wearing her usual cozy knitwear. Instead, she was dressed in a razor-sharp tailored black crepe dress by Loro Piana, her posture impeccably straight. Beside her on a silver tray rested a bottle of Chateau Margaux, already decanted, and a single crystal wine glass. She looked entirely different, radiant, commanding, and frighteningly calm. "You're late," Charlotte said, her voice smooth and devoid of its usual warmth. She took a slow sip of her wine. David swallowed hard, forcing a weary, tragic smile onto his face. He walked forward, running a hand through his damp hair. "Charlotte, darling, I need you to sit down. Something terrible has happened. There's been a hostile takeover. A Swiss trust called Vanguard Heritage managed to exploit a loophole in our corporate bylaws. They've frozen everything. It's a complete nightmare. We're going to have to be very careful with our spending for a little while." Charlotte watched him for a long moment. She did not gasp. She did not rush to comfort him. She simply swirled the dark red wine in her glass, her eyes locked onto his. "A hostile takeover," she repeated slowly. How awful for you. Did these Swiss corporate raiders also orchestrate a hostile takeover of the penthouse at the Wellington for one site? The air in the room seemed to vanish. David froze, his jaw slackening. A cold sweat broke out across the back of his neck, entirely separate from the freezing rain. What? He choked out. What are you talking about? The penthouse in Grosvenor Square. David. Charlotte clarified her tone, conversational but lethal. The one you leased for £20 million using embezzled corporate funds. The one you intended to share with a 24-year-old Instagram influencer who wears too much Baccarat Rouge 540. David physically staggered backward, his knees hitting the edge of the coffee table. His mind raced desperately, trying to compute how his quiet, gallery-working wife knew about the most highly guarded secrets of his double life. Charlotte, listen to me. No, you will listen? She interrupted, her voice slicing through the room like a steel blade. She set her wine glass down with a sharp clink. Did you honestly believe you were that clever, that you could funnel millions of pounds through offshore shell companies to buy a custom graph diamond necklace, and no one would notice that you could discard me for a social climbing parasite and keep me safely stored in Chelsea like an old coat? She meant nothing. David shouted, the panic fully overtaking him. He fell to his knees in front of her, reaching for her hands. Charlotte, I swear to God she was a mistake, a midlife crisis. I was stressed the firm was growing too fast and she threw herself at me. I don't love her. I love you. I came home to you. You came home because Chloe left you in a Costa coffee the moment your black card declined, Charlotte corrected flawlessly. She pulled her hands away from his grasp in absolute disgust. David stared at her, his eyes wide with sheer terror. How do you know that? Charlotte reached onto the side table and picked up a thick leather-bound folder. She dropped it onto the floor directly in front of David's knees. Those are divorce papers, Charlotte said coldly. You will sign them tonight. You are relinquishing any claim to this house, my personal accounts in the gallery. David looked at the papers, and a sudden, ugly surge of desperate anger flared in his chest. He was a cornered animal, and his arrogant instincts flared to life. He scrambled to his feet, glaring down at her. You think you can just hand me papers and kick me out? David snarled, his face red. I am ruined, Charlotte. I have nothing left. I'm not signing anything. Half of this house belongs to me. By law, you have to support me. I'll drag this divorce out in the courts for years. I'll take half your miserable gallery salary. You can't just throw me onto the street. Charlotte did not flinch. She looked up at him, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across her face. You really do not understand the situation you are in, do you, David? I understand perfectly. David fired back, his voice echoing in the quiet living room. He was pacing now, a frantic, aggressive energy taking over. You hired a private investigator. Fine. You caught me cheating. Fine. But Vanguard took my company, and until I get it back, my name is on the deed to this townhouse just as much as yours is. You aren't a lawyer, Charlotte. You're an art historian. You don't have the capital to fight me in court. Actually, Mr. Lawson, your name is not on the deed to this property. The voice did not belong to Charlotte. It came from the shadows of the adjacent dining room. David whipped his head around. A tall man in a charcoal pinstripe suit stepped into the light of the living room, holding a sleek silver briefcase. David felt the breath leave his lungs, as if he had been punched in the chest. It was the same man who had walked into his Mayfair boardroom 12 hours earlier and single-handedly destroyed his life. Montgomery, David whispered, his mind short-circuiting. What the hell are you doing in my house? Alistair Montgomery ignored David entirely. He walked over to Charlotte, gave a deep formal bow, and handed her the silver briefcase. The final asset transfer confirmations, Your Highness. Lawson and Company has been entirely liquidated and the funds returned to the Sovereign Trust. David's brain simply stopped functioning. He stared at Alistair, then looked at Charlotte. Your Highness. What is he talking about, Charlotte? Why is the director of Vanguard Heritage in our living room? Charlotte stood up. In the low light of the room, she looked taller, imperious, and utterly untouchable. The facade of the mild-mannered Chelsea wife fell away, completely revealing the aristocratic steel beneath. Vanguard Heritage Trust is not a consortium of Swiss investors, David, Charlotte said quietly. It is a shadow corporation, a front designed to manage the private international assets of the House of Holstein. David shook his head, a nervous, hysterical laugh escaping his throat. Holstein. The European royal family. Charlotte, you're making no sense. My full name is Princess Charlotte Amelia of the House of Holstein. She stated, her voice echoing with centuries of absolute authority. King Leopold is my father. When we married, my father was furious that I chose a junior banking analyst over a titled aristocrat. But he wanted me to be secure, so he instructed Alistair to create a blind trust approach your struggling firm and inject £3 billion of royal capital into your accounts to ensure my husband was successful. David stumbled backward, hitting the wall. The color drained from his face until he was ashen. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. You didn't build an empire. David? Charlotte continued, her words landing like physical blows. You were a pet project, a charity case funded by my family. Every deal you closed, every suit you bought, every extravagant dinner you attended was paid for by my father's sovereign wealth fund. No, David whimpered, clutching his head. No, I worked for that money. I brought in clients. You brought in nothing that wasn't carefully orchestrated by Vanguard to inflate your pathetic ego, Alistair Montgomery interjected smoothly. You were given a sandbox to play in, Mr. Lawson, and instead of being grateful, you decided to steal the sand. The full, horrifying reality of his situation crashed down on David with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He hadn't just cheated on his wife. He had embezzled money from a ruling monarch. The penthouse at the Wellington. Charlotte said softly, stepping closer to him. That is the Harrington estate, owned entirely by my father. You used my family's money to rent my family's property to house your mistress. You bought her a Cartier watch from the same jeweler who makes my mother's tiaras. David sank to the floor, wrapping his arms around his knees. He was weeping now, loud, ugly, gasping sobs of absolute devastation. The Titan of Mayfair was gone, replaced by a broken, pathetic fraud who had finally looked behind the curtain of his own life. Charlotte, please. David begged, his face wet with tears. He crawled toward her, trying to grasp the hem of her dress, but Alistair stepped forward, blocking his path with a highly polished shoe. Please, I didn't know who you were. I'm so sorry. I'll do anything. I'll sign the papers. Just please don't let them send me to prison. I'll pay it all back. You will sign the divorce papers, Charlotte commanded, looking down at him with an expression of profound emptiness. And you will not go to prison because dragging my family's name into a public embezzlement trial would be highly distasteful. Instead, you are going to simply disappear from my world. Alistair opened the silver briefcase, bypassing the financial documents, and pulled out a cheap, scuffed duffel bag. He dropped it next to David. Your original belongings, Mr. Lawson, Alistair said. The clothes you owned before you married Her Highness. Your credit cards have been canceled. Your phone has been disconnected. You have exactly £20 in your pocket for a train ticket out of London. David looked at the duffel bag, his entire body shaking. He looked up at the woman he had underestimated, betrayed, and ultimately underestimated again. She was a queen casting out a traitor. Stand up, David, Charlotte said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Take your bag and get out of my house. Trembling, entirely broken, David grabbed the handle of the cheap bag. He didn't look back as he shuffled out of the living room, out the front door, and into the freezing London rain, stepping into a life of absolute ruin. The heavy oak door of the Chelsea townhouse clicked shut, and with it, the entire universe David Lawson had known ceased to exist. He stood on the wet pavement, the freezing rain soaking through his thin cotton shirt, gripping the cheap duffel bag that contained the pathetic remnants of his former life. He had £20 in his pocket. Just 24 hours earlier, he had casually tipped a sommelier more than triple that amount. Now it was the exact sum required to buy a one-way off-peak train ticket out of London. He walked toward Victoria Station like a hollowed-out ghost. every step pulling him further away from the glittering, intoxicating world of Mayfair and plunging him into the grim, unforgiving reality of the life he actually deserved. Over the next 6 months, the absolute precision of Alistair Montgomery's destruction became terrifyingly clear. Vanguard Heritage had not merely taken David's money, they had surgically erased his professional existence. When David attempted to secure a position at other financial firms, leaning on his supposed track record, as a titan of wealth management, he was met with locked doors and silent phones. The financial district of London is a small interconnected ecosystem, and the Whisper Network had already received its absolute directive: David Lawson was toxic. He was flagged on international banking compliance registries, silently blacklisted from ever holding a fiduciary license again. Desperate, starving, and entirely abandoned by his former high society friends, David eventually found himself in a cramped, damp bedsit in the bleak industrial outskirts of Slough. The man who had once arrogantly managed a £3 billion sovereign wealth fund was forced to take a minimum wage night shift position, doing data entry for a regional haulage company. Instead of wearing bespoke Tom Ford suits and dining on beluga caviar at the Ned, he wore a faded polyester uniform and ate cold tinned soup in a break room that smelled of diesel fuel. Every time he looked at the spreadsheets on his cheap flickering monitor, logging invoices for shipments of frozen fish and industrial supplies, the memory of his £20 million penthouse would crush his chest, leaving him gasping for air in the dim, miserable light of his new reality. Chloe Sinclair's descent was equally spectacular, driven by the ruthless, predatory nature of the very social circles she had worshipped. Following the humiliation at Hatton Garden, Chloe had frantically attempted to leverage her Instagram following to secure a sponsor, practically begging for a free flight to Dubai to escape the impending scandal. But Alistair Montgomery's team was thorough. A perfectly timed anonymous leak to a notorious London gossip blog detailed the eviction at the Wellington, the frozen credit cards, and the confiscation of the stolen Graf diamonds. In the brutal, status-obsessed world of influencers, poverty was the ultimate sin. Chloe was instantly radioactive. Her wealthy friends blocked her number, and brands quietly canceled her PR packages. In a final act of desperation, she tried to sell her remaining designer handbags to a luxury consignment boutique in Knightsbridge. The final humiliating blow came when the appraiser informed her that the Celine and Hermes bags David had gifted her over the past 3 months were in fact incredibly high-quality counterfeits. David, it turned out, had started cutting corners to save cash even before Vanguard brought the hammer down. Stripped of her digital empire and her fraudulent wealth, Chloe was forced to face the harsh light of the real world. Today she works behind the cosmetic counter of a mid-tier department store in Croydon. Dressed in a stiff, generic black uniform, her days are spent standing under harsh fluorescent lights, forcing polite smiles as she spritzes passing teenage girls with the very same Baccarat Rouge 540 perfume she once claimed as her signature scent of luxury. While the ghosts of her past wallowed in their well-deserved ruin, Princess Charlotte Amelia of the House of Holstein finally stepped into the light. She did not return to the suffocating confines of the Winter Palace. She had earned her freedom, and she intended to keep it, but she no longer hid behind the disguise of the mild-mannered, quiet wife. When the Victoria and Albert Museum hosted its annual highly exclusive Winter Gala, the most prestigious event of the London social season, the red carpet was brought to a complete standstill. Charlotte arrived not in an understated cashmere sweater, but in a breathtaking, custom-tailored emerald velvet gown by Alexander McQueen. And resting perfectly amidst her dark hair was the legendary Holstein tiara, a stunning constellation of flawless diamonds and emeralds that had been in her royal family for 4 centuries. The paparazzi went into a frenzy. The British aristocracy, who had spent the evening buzzing about the mysterious collapse of Lawson and Company, collectively held their breath as the royal heiress ascended the grand staircase. She was radiant, commanding, and entirely untouchable. She was a woman who had been dragged into the dirt by the greed of a commoner, only to emerge as the undisputed queen of the board. She smiled for the cameras, her posture impeccable, knowing that miles away, in a dingy room in Slough, her ex-husband was likely watching the live broadcast on a cracked smartphone screen, finally understanding the sheer monumental scale of what he had thrown away. And that is exactly how a true queen handles a betrayal. Charlotte didn't just break their hearts. She dismantled their entire lives and took back every single penny that belonged to her royal family. If you loved watching this arrogant husband and his greedy mistress get the ultimate brutal reality check they deserved, make sure to smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who loves a flawless, calculated revenge plot. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next real-life drama. See you in the next video.